Let's look at CaptureHandler as a microservice. What CaptureHandler does is allows us to take screenshots of any page, and behind the scenes, it uses Chrome to take these screenshots. The way you add a CaptureHandler is by specifying a URL, naming the microservice as anything, and putting in a pattern indicating where the CaptureHandler is going to be located. So we're going to place it at /capture, and that the handler is CaptureHandler, and in the quarks, specify the engine as Chrome. Now let's try that out. I'm going to create a gramex.yaml in which I'll copy this content and paste it. That's exactly as we had written it here. Now from that directory, let's run Gramex. What Gramex is going to do behind the scenes is, apart from loading this configuration, behind the scenes, it also starts node.js and runs capture handler. And by default, it runs it at port 9900. So here's where it's starting capture handler, and it then pings the capture handler behind the scenes at port 9990 and confirms that it is actually live. So now if we visit the URL /capture, let's do that. I go to /capture, and this is actually a response from capture handler which says I can't serve this request because it needs a question mark URL equals. Capture handler takes screenshots for any URL that's specified with capture handler question mark URL is equal to. Let's specify the Wikipedia homepage. Yeah, let's take this one and paste this. What that does is fetches that page and downloads it as a PDF file, which is actually a screenshot of the file that we specified. Before we go into the options that we can pass to the URL and capture it differently, let's look at the various other options that we have for capture handler itself. By default, it runs at port 9900, which is something that you saw a short while ago. Yeah, capture handler is running at port 9900. This is an internal port. The end user has nothing to do with it. In all likelihood, as a developer, you won't need to change it. But if for whatever reason you do not want to use port 9900, for example, if some other app is running at that port, then you can change this to some other port, let's say port 9901, and save it. And then let me restart Gramex. It will, instead of port 9900, behind the scenes use port 9901. And that is what's happening here. You can actually directly visit this port to try out the functionalities of the backend version of Capture Handler. So here you can type in the URL that you want to capture and fill in several other slots. But this is only a debugging interface. This is not an interface that's exposed via Gramex to the end user. This will only be available in the same machine that is on the local host at a specific port that you're running Gramex on. This apart, you can also specify the URL of a different capture handler. Supposing we have two Gramex instances running. One of them is already running a capture handler. Then the next instance of Gramex can have a URL where we say don't use our own instance of capture handler, use a different instance of capture handler. So let me try that out. I'm going to create a new bash instance. And I'm going to create a new directory. So Gramex2. So we have a folder called Gramex2 in which I'll take a gramex.yaml. Now this gramex.yaml, let's say, has the URL capture2. It could be /capture as well, doesn't matter. But the port will not be specified here. Instead, we will specify the URL as the local host port 9901 where it's already running. Now with this, if I run a second instance of Gramex and I'll run Gramex at port, let's say 8080. So we now have a second instance of Gramex that's starting up. Now this is not going to run its own instance of capture handler. It's pinging capture handler at localhost colon 9901 and it finds that it works just fine. So if I go to localhost colon 8080, which is Gramex, and then go to capture2, this screenshot service is actually the same screenshot service that the first instance of Gramex was running. What this allows you to do is have multiple instances of Gramex reuse the same microservice for capture handler behind the scenes. Another thing that you can do is change the timeout. So for example, let's say I put in the URL is equal to gramner.com/gramex and load this page. Behind the scenes, this is going to fetch the URL and it's also loading a whole series of fonts and it downloads it. But that you saw took a fair bit of time. Supposing it failed and the timeout was not enough. For example, let me explicitly put in a URL of http://bin.org with a delay of 15 seconds. Let me start by not putting in a delay. Let me start by putting in a delay of 1 second so you can see what that output will look like. So within 1 second, it gets a screenshot saying, here is the response from HTTP bin. Let me now put in a delay of 15 seconds. So it's going to hit the page and the page is going to take a full 15 seconds to load and this request will time out. What you should see is an error response saying, yeah, timeout during the request. If we want to avoid this kind of a timeout, so if we know, for example, that the page that we're going to capture takes a longer time, then we can specify a longer timeout. So for example, we are specifying a timeout of 20 seconds. Let's do that now. Gramex, okay, let me add this, not to, sorry, I shouldn't be adding it to this, the Gramex instance. It's pointing to an existing Chrome capture. Let me close that. I should be running it on the Gramex instance that actually starts Chrome capture. So out here, let's add the timeout and restart. So now Gramex would be starting with the timeout. Let's take /capture and question mark http bin.org https colon sorry, that's URL equals https //http bin.org/delay/15. Now it's going to go through the same loop again. It's opening the URL http bin.org/delay/15. That's going to take 15 seconds. And in the meantime, because the timeout has been set to 20, it still waits and it has actually succeeded in completing that request. So now we see the screenshot and this is the result for the 15-second delay request. Another thing that you can do is explicitly specify a command line to run the capture handler backend. The way you do that is by specifying a CMD colon. And this allows you to pick a different path for Node. Supposing you have multiple versions of Node running or Node is not on your path, then you can explicitly specify which Node instance to run and the full path to where Chrome Capture is located. Chrome Capture.js is a part of Gramex, so it will be located exactly where Gramex is located. So for example, if I say pip show Gramex, that will locate where Gramex is installed. And we see that the location is in this particular directory. So let me go to that directory. And inside this, we have a series of files. Let's open this in an Explorer. So this is where Gramex is installed on my machine. Under that, you have the folder Gramex, under which you have the folder handlers. And I'm sorry, it's not under folder handlers, it's under the folder apps. And under that, there's a folder called capture, where you'll find Chrome capture.js. So this is the path that you'll have to specify if you want to run your own instance of Node and point it to run this particular Chrome capture.js. And you can specify it other command line options. The one important command line option you ought to remember is port, which you should explicitly specify. If you do this, then you can point capture handler to this instance, which will be running at localhost colon 9992. If you want to run this behind a proxy, that is, if your system is not able to access the internet and therefore capture handler cannot directly connect to the internet, then you need to set the all underscore proxy environment variable, which needs to be in caps and point it to the proxy server. You could also set the HTTPS proxy and the HTTP proxy independently, but all proxy is something that takes care of both. But if you set any one of those take priority. So do keep that in mind. In case you're running Capture Handler in a Docker instance or any other headless instance, you need some libraries to be installed. Gramex installs these by default, but if you're installing them, or if you're installing not using the default Gramex setup installation, then make sure that the libraries mentioned here are installed.